9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 16. The Firestorm. The group began to walk across the plain, to the path on the other side. The twins carefully helped the clan walk through the destroyed library, showing them where it was safe to step, telling them to slow down when it was steep. Nobody noticed the sound of flapping wings or the frightened six. The soothsayer looked completely petrified. He stopped walking and began to shiver, clutching his loose key to his chest. The sky is breaking, he whispered, still shaking violently and bending over as if he was in pain. 9 turned around at Six's whisper, seeing that the older Stitchpunk crouched down and shivering. He approached him slowly, a reassuring hand outstretched. "Six, are you okay?" he asked gently, while the others noticed the banded ragdoll's plight. Six looked up at him and reached forward, grasping 9's arm and pulling him down. He leaned very closely to the perplexed young man, his lips nearly touching the side of his head, where his hearing sensor was. "Please, save us," Six whispered. 9 pulled back, the soothsayer still grasping his arm, terrified. The zipper Stitchpunk stared down at him, clasping the frightened ragdoll's hand reassuringly. "The sky, 9. The sky is breaking. The burning sky is breaking," Six repeated, looking up at him in horror and tightening his grip. 9 stared at him, startled. He could feel his chest tightened as he realized what Six meant. The others stared as well. This meant something was coming for them, and coming fast. Suddenly, a shadow passed over them as something large flew by the window. 9's head snapped up to the dusty window above them, where weak morning sunlight streamed in, the dust motes swirling serenely in the light. It illuminated the splintered path on the other side of the plain, leading back into the library, their only escape. The shadow then suddenly turned around. It was heading for the cracked window. Its silhouette became larger and larger by the second. "It's coming through the glass!" 5 screamed. "Run! Run now!" 9 shouted at them, grabbing Six by the shoulder and forcing him to run. Everyone, even 1, obeyed him and began to run across the sleeve. As soon as they ran underneath the window, it shattered with a horrible sound of breaking glass. The deadly razor shards rained upon the Stitchpunks. They skilled to a stop and covered their heads with their arms, trying to avoid the glass that could so easily cut through them. The large body suddenly crashed upon the plain, causing it to rock violently. It shifted slightly, hanging precariously over the chasm below. The tremors were so violent, the left wing of the plane hit the path, breaking it into splinters. The plane lurched forward, sending the clan tumbling down the metal body. Everyone tried to grab onto the pieces of shrapnel sticking out from the metal, or onto one another. They were all separated, and they were trapped. The plane rocked upwards, straightening it out. 9 looked up and gasped as he laid straight upon the fire beast. The monster was gigantic and bulky. It stood on 8 razor-edged talons, flapping its blood-red fabric wings. One single crimson eye stared menacingly at the Stitchpunks below, snarling and shrieking. This vicious, owl-like monster lifted one clawed foot. Below its body, the twins were trying to avoid the talons that attempted to capture them and bring them back to the master. The fire beast had nearly landed on top of them, but the boys were trapped underneath it. Suddenly, the beast slammed its talons onto the plane. 3 narrowly avoided the claw slicing through his chest. The claws were stuck into an aluminum, throwing off its balance. It extended its wings, trying to regain its unsteady balance. The plane rocked to the left, and 3 slids along the metal growing out from underneath the beast. 7, who was nearby, opened her arms and caught them, holding them to her chest protectively. The airplane then leveled out. 4 was still trying to dodge the claws. His mouth opened with a silent scream of terror. 3 reached towards his brother, trying to rush to him, but 7 held him to her chest firmly, steadily. Instead, 9 darted towards the beast. The fire beast noticed him and hissed, sparks flying from his beak. He held up his pen blade at the fire beast, snapped down upon him. Instead of tearing through the stitch punk, its sharp tip of the blade was jammed straight through its beak. It screamed as 9 threw himself underneath it, reaching forward and grabbing 4. The traumatized stitch punk clung to him tightly as he ran out from underneath the beast. It shook its head, trying to get the blade out of its mouth. Throwing its head to the side, the staff clattered to the ground. It hissed at the retreating 9, who held 4 to his chest, tucking its head down and trying to get away as fast as possible. He fell to his knees beside 7 and 3 and looked at 4. "It's okay. It's going to be okay," he promised 4 as he set him down gently. 3 wrapped his arms around his shaking brother. The fire beast then turned to them, and the 4, whirling around it, began to advance upon them, its talons flexing, spreading its wings. 9 and 7 held the trembling, terrified twins beside them, trying to shield them from any harm. They cringed as the beast reared and shrieked, shooting sparks at them. There was no possible escape.
"Leave him alone!"
8 rushed forward in front of the 4, bravely meeting the beast head-on. He unsheathed his sword with surprising speed and thrust it into the face of the beast, right underneath its eye. It screeched in anger and pain, and 8 retreated, pulling back his sword. The fire beast snipped at the metallic teeth on its shoulder plates with its sharp beak. 8 was unharmed, and the fire beast screeched again as its beak cracked. While it shook its head in a bewildering pain, it nearly blinded it. 8 kneeled beside the 4. He reached out to the twins. 7 pushed them into the guardian's strong arms, and he cradled the two youngest into his chest as he ran up the body of the plane. 9 and 7 followed closely, running as fast as their legs could carry them to the tail. It was broken and leaning against the buttress below. The beast recovered itself, shrieking, and leaped off the plane. The monster plummeted into the chasm below. It then suddenly spread its wings, and the howling wind that blew through the crater caught the underside of the thick fabric wings. It began to glide around the library, screaming. It helped the others onto the tail where 1 sat. The fire beast suddenly rushed towards them, opening its beak. The blowtorch sparked, and its beak light with raging fire. 9 whirled around to see the beast sucking in the fire, realizing that it was about to do. He barely had enough time to think before he snatched 7's spear from her hands, using it to pull up a loose sheet of aluminum from the body of the plane. He reached up and pulled up the sheet of metal like a shield until it covered the others, bracing himself against a bolt in the aluminum. "Get behind me!" he yelled to them. They obeyed, huddling behind a small body. An enormous bellowing jet of flame blasted from its beak, heading straight for them. The flames hit squarely against the metal, making it red hot in seconds. 9 closed his eyes and pulled even harder, tightening his burning fingers as the fire continued to scorch the shield. But leave the 7 stitch punks unharmed. The flames then subsided, and 9 let the metal drop. He clutched his hands to his chest, bending over in pain and grimace. 7 seized his wrist and looked at his hands. They weren't melted, but smoldering hot and tarnished. 9 pulled his hands from hers gently. I'm okay, he said reassuringly, while the others still crouched together. 5, who was alone on the right wing of the plane, watched in horror as the fire beast circled back around and opened his beak. Again, hissing, with his swift, trained fingers, 5 wrapped around his crossbow and loaded it with an arrow. Bracing himself, he aimed the arrow right where it wanted it, and shot it with prominent accuracy. The arrow whistled through the air and tore straight through the blowtorch, ripping it right out of its chest. The monster screamed as it was wrenched to the side, tumbling over and over as the flaming torch swirled down into a pit below. On impact, the sparks and flames from the torch consumed the many books and pages lying in the dark pit, engulfing the chasm with dancing, bellowing flames. Black smoke quickly arose into the air. The fire beast managed to recover itself, flapping its crimson wings against the thermals raising from the fire. It circled above the pit and rushed the plane again. Reaching out with its talons, it grabbed a cable hanging on from the plane, wrenching it backwards. The wire then snapped. The plane rebounded and swinging downwards. The stitch punks all immediately struggled for something to grab onto. 9 grabbed a hold of the piece of wire, trying to pull himself up. Suddenly, he noticed that 7 was no longer beside him and had disappeared. Hastily looking around, the young man spotted her below him, holding tightly onto a jagged piece of metal barely sticking out from the plane. 7 was struggling to hold onto the rebar as she was slipping. "Sev!" 9 called over his shoulder. She looked up as he reached down to her. He was nowhere near close enough to grab her hand. The burlap stitch punk then noticed 7's spear was lodged to the plane beside him. Wrenching it from the metal, he stabbed it into the body below him. Swinging down, holding onto the spear, he reached for 7, straining as far as he could. 7 reached back for him, their fingers nearly touching. Suddenly, a piece of rebar she held onto snapped. 7 plummeted down with a startling shout. "No!" 9 cried. The female stitch punk slid backwards down the body of the plane. She tried to turn herself around and stop her fall, but there was nothing she could grab onto. Eyes widened. 7 gasped as she saw the billowing pit of fire below she was falling towards. She could feel the heat on her face, ravenous warmth that would engulf her in an instant and devour her until there was nothing left. 7's efforts were useless as she plunged over the edge of the plane, crying out. Suddenly, she felt something close tightly around her chest as she came to an abrupt halt. She looked up, surprisingly, as she hung precariously over the fire-engulfing chasm below. 9 had thrusted her spear onto the side of the plane and was hanging from it, his arm wrapped tightly and securely around 7, saving her from the fall. "Just hold on, 7. Just hold on to me," he told her firmly. However, she could easily hear how his voice shook, the terminals rising from the bellowing fire and the whistling wind outside merged, causing the plane to rock up and down violently in the gusts. 7 wrapped her arms around 9's shoulders as he tightened his grip on her, the two swinging in perilous place between life and death. 9 held tightly to the spear, wincing as his weak shoulders gave a twinge of pain. However, he kept his arms tightly around 7, pulling her even closer. "Okay, now climb onto my shoulders, and then onto your spear and get yourself out of the plane. I'll be right behind you," he told her once the plane stopped rocking. "I won't leave you," she began firmly. However, Nine shook his head. The only thing he needed to do was to get Seven to safety. "Please, Sev, just go," he urged her, and she grimaced slightly. Before she pressed her face onto his shoulder, he touched his temple to hers in reassurance, clutching her tightly for just a moment. She didn't have to tell him anything. He already knew it would never tell anyone else. Finally, she gripped his shoulders, and he used his free hand to help her up. She carefully climbed onto his shoulder. Straightening slowly, Nine held her steadily as she climbed onto the spear jutting from the side of the plane. Reaching up, she grasped the edge of the plane and swung herself up, finally back onto level ground and away from the blazing heat. Immediately turning, she peered over the side. Nine still hung with one hand onto the spear further below. She reached down and grasped his hand, pulling him onto the plane. He finally managed to scramble upwards and onto the body. Pulling her spear up behind him, the fire beast suddenly landed onto the plane again, as it saw the vulnerable ragdolls, causing it to shake. The two lost their balance, falling down the body together. Seven reacted quickly, reaching out and grabbing onto the metallic beam of the cockpit. Her hand flying out, she grasped Nine's hand tightly, ceasing their fall. As the tremor subsided, the two stood, looking up towards the buttress where the others waited. He was so far away now. They suddenly whirled around as the fire beast appeared in front of them, its single eye staring down at them. It began to advance, snapping its sharp beak in loud clicks. An unearthly screeching noise came from the razor talons dragging along the aluminum. 9 and 7 both tensed, knowing that there was no escape. Suddenly, without warning, 9 forcibly pushed 7 down against the metal covering of the cockpit. He tucked her chin to her chest as he kneeled before her, placing his hands together in the cockpit. He covered her body with his own, trying to protect her from harm, giving his life for hers without a second thought. The beast raised its talons to dig its razor claws into Nine's back. Something rushed by them, and their heads snapped up as it looked. 8 ran past them, giving a menacing roar. He raised his sword and met the beast face to face once again. He swung his blade through the air, and with a single swipe, cut one of the fire beast's wings off. The knife sliced through each cable, sparks flying everywhere. The wing whirled around into the fire below, immediately burning into nothing but ash and warped metal. The fire beast screamed as it was thrown off balance and crashed into the side of the plane, rocking it violently. 9 and 7 looked up at the beast screeching. 7 then noticed her spear had landed right beside her. 9 released 7 as she leapt onto her feet, grabbing her spear. She ran as fast as she could towards the beast, which was still shrieking like mad. She raised her spear above her head, but the beast spotted her at last second, its single eye glowing angrily as it turned its head and lifted a foot, trying to dig its talons into her and tear her to shreds. However, 7 had no plans to die today. She leapt, pushing against the fire beast's skull with one foot. She was propelled into a back flip over the monster, swinging her spear out in front of her. The razor-sharp blade sliced through each cable and wire in the second wing. The fire beast lurched to the side as the wing flew off, following the other into the fire. 7 landed gracefully on her feet, grinning in triumph. The plane was rocking up and down, balanced on the buttress, but still hanging precariously over the fire pit. The beast was still shrieking and screaming as 8 and 9 ran over to 7, making sure that she made it past the monster. She ran around it, following her companions. However, the beast rose one of its clawed feet and tried to slam it down upon 7. She dodged it, easily, and the talons became lodged deep into the aircraft's body. The fire beast screeched and threw itself backwards, attempting to pull itself out, but it was stuck tight. Its futile struggles only resulted in the snapping of the wings of the plane. The entire body was groaning weakly. Cracks appeared in its warping metal. It began to slip forward down towards the fire pit. A violent tremor caused Six, who was still holding on to his key and standing on one of the wings, to stumble and fall backwards with a shout. The key flew out of his hands and landed on the buttress. His eyes widened with pure terror as he fell towards the beast. He landed hard to his side and slid down the plane, still plummeting downwards towards the propeller casing.
Six! Hold on! I'm coming!
Five cried as he jumped down the body of the plane towards his friend. Usually, he would never have done such a crazy, stupid stunt, but something in his heart led him to save Six. Two was desperately clinging to the side of the plane, scrambling helplessly at the metal while the other stood on the tail precariously, trying to keep an unsteady balance. They watched in horror as Five grabbed Six's hand and braced himself against the propeller casing, trying to pull Six up. Two was slipping, crying out. Abe made sure his leader was well secured on the buttress before rushing down. He took Two in his arms and depositing him right by one as the plane groaned loudly. Two asked his leader if he was still all right, although the old man himself was trembling violently. One scoffed indifferently. Five still managed to pull Six up the edge of the propeller casing, the two boys trembling with fright. The beast saw them nearby and screamed. It threw its body to the side, still lodged in the body. The plane lurched, sending the two flying up towards the monster. It was now extremely close, straining and trying to get to them. The fire beast suddenly unhooked one of its talons and managed to wrap a single claw around Six's neck. It gave a vicious yank, wrenching his head backwards and pulling him away from Five. The one-eyed Stitch Punk immediately grabbed onto one of Six's hands, holding tightly to one of the beams of the cockpit with the other. The banded male Stitch Punk cried out with fright as the fire beast pressed against its throat. He was either going to asperhexidate him or break his neck. The groaning of the metal became louder as the beast began to struggle. The plane began to slip and jerk around. The groaning noise became even louder. Nine stood atop the tail, watching in horror as Five struggled to save Six. The violent shaking forced everyone onto their knees, trying not to fall into the fire pit. Eight made to grab for the twins. He managed to wrap Three tightly in his arms before slipped out of his grasp. He lunged for the child, but wasn't quick enough. Then, to everyone's surprise, one threw himself forward, swinging his staff out towards Four. The mute Stitch Punk made a grab for it, managing to. One grunted as he struggled to hold onto the staff. Nine grabbed onto it, helping one pull up the younger Stitch Punk back onto the buttress. The burlap male reached down and tried to grab Four's hand. The little ragdoll reached back, up towards him, but suddenly lost his grip, plummeting down, silently crying out. Without thinking, Nine left for where he stood, flying down towards Four. He grabbed the younger boy with his arms and held him to his chest. He slammed painfully onto the back of a piece of rebar, still holding on to Four. "I got you," he reassured little Four, as he clung to Nine desperately, struggling to find a foothold. Nine pushed Four up to Eight, who grabbed his hand and pulled him back onto safety. He turned and reached for Nine, but was too late. The plane rocked, and Nine was thrown into the air, falling backwards into the fire below. Everything in his body seemed to freeze in place. Nine's chest constricted, and he couldn't scream. He couldn't make a single sound. He could only close his eyes and wait for death, as the hot wind enveloped him. Suddenly, something close around his wrist. His arm snapped. His arm snapped, caught, and his body dangled over the pit of fire. 9 opened his eyes and looked in astonishment. "Didn't I tell you balance is the key?" 7 said down to him. She had thrusted her spear into the wall, holding onto it tightly as she caught him, dangling precariously. 9 smiled up at her in amazement. He then looked down, trying to find his friends. 5 was straining and struggling to hold on to both the beam and his friend's hand. 6 had closed his eyes and was trying to somehow pry the claw from his neck, which only tightened around him. He was gasping desperately for breath. 9 knew that he didn't have much time left. The wing began to break even more. Only a few cables holding it to the plane now. If the plane fell, then they all would be killed. The wing began to snap further and fell down into a 90-degree angle. Pointing downwards, it creaked and groaned as it slid down further into the pit. 7 gave a shout of stress, trying to keep a hold on to both her friend and her spear. 9 slammed against the wing as it came to an abrupt rest, chest first. The air left his synthetic lungs, and he hung limply, winded. After a few moments, he finally managed to grasp for air and looked down beneath him at the 2 far below the wing.
9! It's gonna fall!
5 cried up to him. He looked over his shoulder. He was beginning to slip himself as the beast began to overpower him. 6 struggles were becoming weaker, his strangled breathing ragged. He was becoming increasingly lightheaded. He could not think. He could not breathe, and his chest was seizing up. 9 knew that something had to be done, and fast. He looked desperately around for something, anything he could use to somehow get down to 5 before he lost 6, and they were both killed. Looking up at 1, 2, and 8 and the twins, he spotted a rope hanging across the library roof above 8's head.
8! Throw me the end of the rope!
He cried up to point to him. The guardian looked up above him, eyes following 9's finger above his head. He reached up for the rope, easily grabbing it, and swung the end down at 9. He tied it around his waist, mirroring what he had done to get 6's body out of the chasm. He looked up at 7, who was still holding onto him, still clinging to his spear.
Hold on to their end, 8. Guys, get onto the shelf behind you. 7, you gotta let me go and get back to the others,
he instructed, pulling his hand out of hers and clinging onto the rope now.
9, wait!
7 began, reaching after his hand. 9 cut her off, giving her a look of utmost pleading. There was no time to argue.
7, get back to the others. I've got to get them before they're killed. Please!
He pleaded, his eyes wide. 7 looked like she might argue further, but she reluctantly obeyed. She managed to climb back up to the others. 2 of the twins helped her onto the tail, then onto the shelf that was underneath the tail of the plane, a broken rafter of the old library. 9 began to slide down to 5 and 6. 8 kept keeping a tight, strong hold on the rope. He didn't know how he was going to get them both away from the deadly monster, but he was going to do anything it took to save them. Then the cables holding the wing up snapped all together. The entire plane slid down from where it had once rested on the roof. 5 just managed to pull 6 out of the surprised beast's grasp, but the 2 began to slide down towards the flame crater as the plane fell. 9 yelled in fright as he saw them fall. He knew if he didn't act now, they would die. Clinging tightly to the rope, he leapt, hurtling down towards the 2. The chaos seemed to slow in motion. 9 was falling down into the inferno. 5 and 6 were falling too. The plane was plummeting. The fire beast plunged down into the pit, screeching. Without its wings, it fell like a stone through the burning air. It was then crushed to death beneath the aircraft, exploding in a huge ball of flames. Everything erupted into an enormous fireball, engulfing the crater below. The rope snapped taut.
No!
She screamed, hanging over the shelf, giving a horrified gasp as her body was illuminated bright orange and yellow from the fire below. Everyone jumped backwards, throwing their arms over their heads as the fire rushed towards them, then withdrew back into the crater. It cackled loudly, a metal groaning slightly as the ravenous flames ate away at it. A thick cloud of black smoke rose into the air, obscuring everything below it. The rope hung down stiffly, the occupant at the end unseen and concealed by smoke. 7 desperately searched the black smoke and yellow fire below for any signs to show her that they were okay. The twins and 2 looked down as well, horror etched over their faces. The oldest of the 3 held the light staff and pen blade tightly at his hands. One was frowning, his anxious expression unreadable, to which he was worried more about the deaths of the 3 young men, or the fire below. 8 looked down in perplexity. The rope was still in its fix. All of a sudden, there was a small, feeble tug of the rope. 7 saw this, and her eyes widened. 8 felt the rope jerk in his hands, and snapped to attention. He immediately began to pull the rope up, grunting as he did so. Attached to the under end was a large, indistinct black shape, which as it rose from the smoke and fire became 3 separate shapes. 6 and 5. The arms wrapped around 9's chest as he clung the other end of the rope. All 3 were covered heavily in ash. Their breathing labored. 7 gave a gasp and smiled widely, slightly in relief. 9 caught her eyes, and her smile widened even further.
Smashing, my boys! Brilliantly done!
2 laughed down to them, slapping his knee. 5 gave a feeble smile up to his mentor, looking dazed. 8 handed the rope end to the twins and 2 who held it tightly, while 9 held 5 and 6 up to 8. To 5, 8 said, "Here you go," as he sat him down, but he roughly dropped 6. The bandit punk sat for a moment, blinking and rubbing his extremely sore neck. He took a couple of very deep breaths. The pain in his neck made it a little hard to breathe, but otherwise he knew that he was fine. Looking around, he spotted his key lying in the buttress beside him. Reaching for it, 6 picked up his key. But then appeared 8. The burly Stitchpunk snatched 6's key from his hands, causing him to frown. 9 struggled to get himself up, but his limbs were shaking so bad, it was a wonder he didn't lose his feeble grip to the rope. 7 reached down and grasped his arm, hoisting him up onto the shelf. He sat to his knees. His arms and hands were still shaking violently as he kept his head bent, panting heavily and coughing weakly. 7 kneeled beside him, looking over him. 5 was nearby, quickly checking the others for injuries, particularly 6. He was rubbing the back of his neck, still trying to breathe deeply. 7 knew 5 was busy at the moment, so she checked 9 for any injuries.
"Are you okay?"
she asked 9, rubbing his back soothingly. He weakly nodded, his voice abandoning him. 7 quickly untied the rope around his waist and threw it beside her, caring about nothing more than the still panic-stricken male Stitchpunk. He looked up at 7, eyes still wide in fright.
"I'm never doing that again."
He managed to say weakly, his usually soothed voice raspy. 7 lunged forward and slightly wrapped her arms around him in a tight embrace. 9 was petrified, and he stiffed as she hugged him tightly. 5 looked over his shoulder, surprised by the commotion. He smiled. 9 blinked down at 7, his eyes wide and his brows raised high. It's, okay, 7. I'm fine. 7 then withdrew, a wide smile on her face as she looked up at him. He returned it slyly, but it was soon replaced by an apologetic grimace as he looked down at 7. She followed his gaze and saw that where his body had touched hers, she was now covered in ash. Her white fabric contrasted heavily with the black residue. Instead of getting angry, she smiled and got to her feet, brushing herself off. "Come here, you," she said, taking 9's hand and helping him to his feet, brushing him off with a gentle hand. She smiled warmly at her in thanks. 5 was then standing beside them, handing off a cloth he'd obviously just used to clean the cinders from his single eye, and 9 nodded gratefully. He cleaned his own eyes, finally able to see properly again. The others were following the twins as they navigated their way off the shelf. The 2 boys glanced over their shoulders, frowning sadly as they saw the home they lived in and loved for so long go up in flames. However, they shook their heads and continued to lead the others out of the burning building. There was nothing they could do about it now. Besides, there were plenty of other books to read, and all of their companions were alive and safe. 7 stayed behind with 9. She placed a hand on his chest, helping him to walk, for he was still shaking fiercely. "That was very brave of you, you know. Thank you for saving my life," 7 said to 9 as they followed each other. He started to look at her, suddenly feeling quite a bit hotter than he had when he was engulfed in smoke. "Oh, well," he stammered, turning, but he was still turning around. The hook on the bottom of his zipper caught in 7's green chest button. I'm sorry," he stammered, immediately going to try to work the seals apart, his hand touching 7's, who had also reached up to work the zipper and button apart. The warmth in his face flared even further. His cheeks nearly touched his, and he hoped she wasn't able to feel the fire burning in his face. Finally, 9's trembling hand managed to free their seals. They straightened and looked at one another. "I'm sorry about that," he stammered, his words getting caught within the workings of his throat. "Yeah," 7 said, looking at him with an expression mingling with embarrassment and annoyance. She reached back up to help him walk, but he gently waved her off. "It's okay." 7's brow furrowed as she turned away from 9, catching up with the others, leaving him severely mortified. He bent his head in humiliation and followed them while the library continued to burn down behind them. End of chapter 16.